"Why are my vampire daughter naked in your cabin, human?" The queen meant it as accusation and decree. Ozone and iron clung to the thin curtain of Jace's cabin while station lights hummed like distant insects. A royal proclamation had opened a blade between worlds. His quiet life was about to end in blood and law and a wedding arranged by violence. The cabin smelled of machine oil and boiled coffee, a small shrine to terrestrial habit on a fringe station where neon algae grew on the bulkheads. In the ceiling, a maintenance fan breathed a low, patient hum. The window let in the scrape of ship traffic and the metallic tang of recycled air. The berth's quilt smelled of sweat and old rain. The walls were too thin for secrets, their insulation woven from industrial glass and a layer of black market polymer that softened sound, but not the station cameras. There was a dent in the doorframe where someone had rammed it once. Jace had learned to sleep with one eye open. He kept his back to the wall, old reflex of a man who had counted echoing bullets and later counted empty beds. The wooden crate under his bunk held a folded jacket, a map with a burned corner, a pocket knife dulled by use. His hands were calloused in places that meant work and in other places that meant fights. His knuckles remembered gravity the way bones remember winter. He drank bitter coffee like an apology and lit a small lamp because the neighbors' hollows flickered gossip like a hive. Mira moved like a rumor when she came through the hatch. A silhouette cut from midnight, limbs rehearsed for violence, hair still wet with blood or rain. Jace could not tell which. Her skin caught the light and rejected it, pale as lunar glass, veins dark as ink. She was naked because someone had stripped ceremony from her. The reasons did not fit neatly into explanations. Her aureate eyes were tired and furious. Royalty sat in them like an ache. People called her the Queen's daughter and said it like a verdict. You could read her as a weapon or a wound. The station's newest proclamation had been posted that morning, ink and authority stitched by royal seals, a public challenge from the Queen, a wedding battle declared for her daughter, a raw law that allowed claimants to contest union by force. The posters dripped with an old language of blood and obligation. Mira's arrival cracked Jace's day into before and after. She moved as one who had practiced falling. Her hollow ribs rose and fell in time with the lamp's tremor. He placed one hand on the table. His sleeve smelled of oil and ground metal, the texture of hard human work. He heard the weight of harness enter the room, the scent of iron, and something sweeter, old wine, sleep, or the tang of stolen blood. Something on her body glinted, a strip of ceremonial thread, the mark of vampire nobility braided into her forearm. They met with the brevity of two people who had no time for soft talk. Mira said nothing for 3 beats, and in those 3 beats the station seemed to lean in. Jace read a list of possible outcomes the way a man might read weather. Likely storm, possible thunder, unlikely mercy. They were both competent. Neither would cower. She had been trained to move like a blade. He had been trained to reinforce walls. She said, with the rasp of someone who had not spoken freely in a courtier's age, "Do not quote protocol to me, Terran." He answered in a cadence learned in briefings and dry halls. "I might be heavy, but I don't shatter." Outside, a courier's boots clacked, and a metal cylinder rolled against the corridor like a drum. Someone had delivered a sealed message. Jace recognized the crest before he read the words. The Queen's sigil stamped into varnished leather. The cylinder hit the floor with a small, obscene sound, and the station sensors registered a spike in attention. The door hissed as cold air returned. They both turned to the ignition blue of the seal. The message could be a threat, a summons, or a decree that ended lives. Mira's jaw tightened. She folded her arms around herself, though she was naked, old armorless habit. Jace found himself suddenly the center of a story he had lined up to avoid. The courier had eyes like knives. The hallway had a dozen cameras. Someone wrote them both into a public ledger the moment the seal broke. The cylinder slid open, and a single sheet fell like a blade. The words read like a weapon. The Queen declared the daughter's marriage contested. Claimants must challenge at once. There was a clause in the law that allowed a stranger to seize sanctuary if they sheltered the daughter overnight. The station notice system began to chirp warnings. Whispers pooled at the vents. The dent in Jace's doorframe seemed to anticipate another break. Mira smiled then, and it was a smile full of bone and cruelty, a blade folding under velvet. Subscribe to see what breaks first, the silence or the bones. Drop a comment. Which secret would you die to protect? The corridor outside Jace's cabin vibrated with the station's pulse. Footsteps pounded like a small militia, voices distant and hot. Mira's breath fogged the lamp. The scent of her skin under ozone filled the room. She made a choice that tasted like iron and possibility. Stay and claim sanctuary with Jace, or run into the Queen's jaws and a parade of claimants. She chose the room for now. The seal on the courier's paper meant the world could descend in minutes. Jace pushed a crate toward the door and braced it with a bar of alloy. It screeched against the floor. He had a plan that was as modest as it was stubborn. Keep the door closed until they could buy time. He was not a man who trusted certainties. The first knock knocked the wallpaper loose. Someone tried the handle and cursed with a syllable of entitlement. Voices pressed the hatch. A legal enforcer read the proclamation out loud outside, voice magnified and oily. Claimants will honor law. There were claws in the words. Mira's eyes caught the doorway mirror, and she flinched at the naked reflection. Her shoulders tensed like tuned wire. She moved forward and took from a shelf a thin strip of cloth. Jace watched her tie it around her waist like a flag. She mocked the ritual of modesty with a small, bitter laugh. "Better my ribs than your tail," she said, and the phrase landed between them like a vow. The lock shuddered. A voice called, "Open! Royal directive." Jace answered with a sentence he had never wanted to say aloud. "No." The hatch shook, and the camera outside tilted as if leaning for spectacle. They had been written into someone else's entertainment. A hand, violent and gloved, tried the window. The first blow left a starburst web across the pane. Glass dusted the air, and their skin tasted of sharpness. The second effort was a battering ram of bodies. Jace shoved the bar deeper into the doorframe. The frame complained with a dry, metallic groan. Guards in ceremonial black uniforms moved down the corridor, their boots whispering against metal. Before the door gave, there was a surge from the corridor, a single figure that pushed the line, a claimant, half merchant, half warrior, face painted with campaign slogans. He brought a pike that hummed with a shallow charge, a legally sanctioned weapon that tested doors. Mira stepped forward like a bell. She could not let the man take the sanctuary without being seen. She had been taught to be a spectacle of pain when politics demanded it. The claimant's pike struck the door. Sparks spattered like frightened fireflies. Jace braced his shoulders. He had been a soldier in another life, and the old patterns returned. Measure distance, anchor weight, apply force. When the pike slid and found purchase, the door bowed inward by an inch. The cabin's thin geometry warped. The claimant pushed once more. Mira's hand moved faster than the sound of policy. She arced forward and struck where the door bent, not at the man, but at the weapon, her forearm a blur. Her knuckles met the alloy of the pike, and the world narrowed to a single, stupid clarity. The pike's shaft rebounded and hit her flank. The strike should have been insignificant, a slap against her side. Instead, there was a spine-shattering sound, crack, the sort of noise that belonged to collapsing bridges and old glass. Time folded. Mira's prehensile sacral crest, a living limb braided with bone and ritual, had collided with the pike's rebound, and a section sheathed in ceremonial silver snapped. It was a literal, audible fracture of living architecture. The bone inside her tail fractured into splinters. She screamed, a sound that parted the air like a new law. Jace heard the way the room held onto that scream for a heartbeat. The scent of metallic sweetness exploded. Her naked body folded at the waist with a sound of fabric and air leaving lungs. For a second, she hung between motion and ruin, some animal trapped between bars. The claimant froze, eyes wide, as guards muttered and cameras panned. The power balance that had been a taut wire snapped. The man with the pike did not know whether to advance or to retreat. For one trembling instant, the attacker became the scene of a new crime, a broken woman in his presence. Jace moved before he thought. His hands were not steady, but they were faster than the corridor's judgment. He closed the distance, scooped her up clumsily. Her weight was wrong, lighter and heavier in the places that mattered, and carried her away from the door as if she were contraband. The guards outside shifted like a chorus, deciding an act. Someone said, hushed and bright, "The Queen will hear of this." Blood had a taste of lemon in the air, and his palm was suddenly slick. He hauled her behind the crate as if he could hide a rupture. Mira's eyes were open but unfocused, the pupils like small black moons. When she tried to speak, the sound was a thin thread. He felt the broken vertebra like grain under skin, a new geography mapping itself. Her tail, half-broken, sloughed bone and cloth and a scent of copper. For 30 seconds, everything hung in the balance. The station's cameras, a cluster of shocked neighbors, the claimant's indecision, and the Queen's looming law. Jace had become a guarantor of an accident not his making. The reversal had occurred. The attacker lay wounded, the defender held her, and the public would turn the wound into spectacle. He tasted iron and terror, and the heat of someone else's life on his arm. The station's warning bells began to ring. Rumors are a kind of weather. Once they start, they get their own currents. Word moved through vents and under doors. The Queen's daughter had been found naked in a cabin, injured and sheltered by a Terran. By the end of the first shift, the corridor was a low hurricane of whispers. People pointed with gloved fingers, ghosts of judgment in their eyes. A vendor sold fried fungus, and a rumor at once. Someone in a far dock replayed the clip until the feed distorted. The guards outside Jace's door became a polite audience more than protection. Mira walked with a brace fitted by a machinist who worked in the market and called himself a healer for tips. The brace caged her sacrum with polished alloy, and its ratchets sang like small guns as they tightened. When she moved, the metal clicked against the station's hum. She wore the brace like a confession. Her steps were careful and precise. There was the sound of leather against metal and the scent of machine oil. Jace pushed a crate down the corridor to mask their passage. The wheels squealed and drew eyes. He had become an unwilling headline, the cabin man who sheltered royalty, that brought admirers, accusers, and parasites. At the market, his face was sketched into satiric hollow portraits. Some called him a fool, others called him heroic. A councilman posted a lecture about sanctuary and law, and the comments filled with exclamations and cruel nicknames. Back at the cabin, Mira let Jace teach her how to move with the brace. He had a slow way of showing, 1 inch left, 3 degrees turn, breathe. He had learned patience in trenches, and now he parceled it out like medicine. His hands were steady around her. The memory of the tail breaking lived in the smell of copper on his fingers. "Trust the small motions," he said. She answered with a flinty laugh. "You teach an exile to dance with their dead." The clinic made them partners in small humiliations. In therapy rooms that smelled of salves and battery acid, they practiced standing without twisting the damaged spine. He steadied her when her balance betrayed her, and she taught him to read a predator's eye, unspoken signals of intent. They swapped histories the way people swap names on long calls, in fragments, not as confession, but as evidence. Mira's past tasted of temple blood and rigged rituals. She had been married by decree at a court that called pain a promise. She had learned to take blows and catalogue them. She told him of a ceremony where flesh had been offered like an oath, where she had been both prize and strategy. Jace told her of a colony that burned because of a map no one believed, of a child who learned hunger as a condition of life, and a father who taught how to aim a rifle at dawn, and of nights where he had to count the sounds of ships to sleep. They both carried the particular grammar of survivors, terse sentences, measured gestures, the way a hand could cover another's and mean this is temporary. Their affinities formed in the small things. He tightened the brace when she asked. She steadied a homemade patch on his forearm. Healing was less miraculous than arithmetic. It arrived as accumulation. The station's magistrates convened, and the political weather shifted. The Queen, at a cold distance, had placed the daughter's marriage under challenge, and the rulebook of blood demanded spectacle. A legal mediator arrived in a ship that smelled of lacquer and old money. His face was smooth and packaged in civility. He declared hearings, cameras, and the necessity of an orderly contest. The price for sheltering royalty was a public hearing, and the world had eyes. The mendings of a broken tale had turned into a political instrument. The Queen could rid herself of inconvenient suitors by declaring them sacred claimants, provoking fights that answered her purposes. Jace realized, in a moment small and sharp, that he had not simply sheltered a wounded person, he had been stamped into a policy. That realization made his hands heavy. The station's feed lit up with arguments and opinions. A woman in the market said under her breath, "Tradition is just peer pressure from dead people," and the sound of her voice threaded into many other threads. Witness reactions multiplied. Guards rubbed their necks with boredom. A child pointed and laughed. A camera smiled like a dead thing. When the tribunal date was posted, it felt like a countdown. Mira grew quieter as press and politics approached. She slept in the day now and tended to the night when Jace left to find spare parts and medical supplies. She learned to hide scars in public and let vulnerability stay private. There was an intimacy that grew not from touch but from duty, the slow recognition that both of them had been shaped by violence and had chosen to keep the other alive anyway. The antagonist emerged from rumor like fog, an admiral at the Queen's command, handsome and precise, who saw the daughter's situation as an opportunity to cement alliances. He had men who answered to nothing softer than orders, and his name carried weight on the station. The admiral wanted the daughter married into his name and had called a private assembly to plan. His spies were already factoring Jace's face into a dossier. The tribunal would not be an impartial contest. It would be a display. The consequence of the broken tale had rippled outward. Politics, pity, and plans. In the dim cabin, Mira curled and let Jace teach her how to breathe into pain. The city outside learned to love the scandal and to hate him in the same breath. This was the new weather they would have to survive. The trap came like a scheduled storm, coded invitation, ornate chamber, and a promise of safe passage. They accepted because refusing would broadcast guilt. The station's public square, where evidence became spectacle, was set with a ring of cameras and a bench of honor for the admiral and his council. The tribunal declared an opening. Statements of provenance, claims of honor, and the Queen's law read with a ceremonial boredness. Mira could not move as she wished. The brace limited rotational torque and made every pivot a calculus. When the chamber doors sealed, Jace felt the air thicken with observation. The admiral's stare measured them both, the wounded royal, the human who sheltered her. He wore the look of a man who had never been surprised. During the ceremony, a staged skirmish erupted. Masked agitators moved through the crowd like codified thunder, a distraction for what the admiral truly wanted. The plan worked. While attention drifted, an assassin's drone descended, its blades whispering like scissors. The drone aimed for the admiral, but found a different target, a flash and a wrong arc that clipped the crowd. Security faltered. Mira could not pivot fast enough to move. The brace made her a slower weapon. Jace moved with the reflexes of his old life, but he was unarmored, and the crowd's momentum was a physical thing. The drone sliced through cloth and slammed into a vendor's stall with a metallic scream. Jace lunged for the vendor and took the first hit, an arc of shrapnel carving a clean, hot line along his side. A hot white pain tracked across his ribs like a ribbon of fire. He tasted copper, and the world tunneled for a beat. His hand found Mira's wrist by instinct. In that second of chaos, another thing happened. Mira's tail, her sacral crest, immobilized, but not dead, found purchase. The small, exposed section of snapped bone had been braced with leather and wire. She used it like a splint and like a weapon. She swung it not with the full force of a healthy limb, but with the focused precision of someone who had learned to weaponize their weakness. The tail hooked the drone's stabilizer with a movement that was half prayer and half misdirection. The drone wobbled, its blades scraping air with a sound like pleading. Her tail wrapped around a fragment of the machine and held, drawing it off course. The drone's fall, redirected, slammed into a structural support and detonated in a shower of sparks and flame that licked at the banners. The crowd panicked and stamped. In doing so, she took the aim off him. But in the small calculus of sacrifice, the edges bent. Her brace tore at the skin when she twisted, a shard of splintered bone that had been exposed cut into her hip. She had used her own fresh injury as a hook, a lifeline for him. He was grazed by shrapnel, but otherwise alive. A vendor less so. It was a trade, and trade is a language of choices. The public watched as the injured woman became the instrument of rescue. Cameras caught the moment, and the clip would loop for days. The power dynamic flipped again. The alleged prize performed a violent and public act of saving the man who had sheltered her. He had always feared she would consume him. He had said so once, in a joke that landed like a confession, and now the thing he feared had saved him instead. They escaped through a back corridor that smelled of disinfectant and burnt smoke. The stairwell was a narrow theater in which Mira directed traffic and Jace hauled injured people. He stumbled. She steadied him with the remaining strength in her splintered limb. Together they bore a limp child, a bleeding vendor, and a man whose jaw had been nearly severed. It was intimate work. Hands in hair, strength in the spine, breath on the neck. They moved like partners, complementing one another without words. After they found a safe room and sealed the door, they inspected each other's wounds. Jace pressed a cloth to the vendor's wound. Mira pressed her forehead to the brace and breathed as if measuring pain. He found himself whispering, which surprised him. "I came here to destroy you," but she cut him off with something softer than scorn. "We are both survivors of brutal systems. We can count on that at least." They shared truths then, small and hot. He had been a spy once for a ragged cell that had died in a fire. She had been offered as a bargaining chip to strengthen an alliance. Neither had wanted the roles allotted by their cultures. In a confined, patched space, they chose a raw honesty. Outside, the Admiral's plan had faltered. He would find someone to blame, but he also found footage he could frame in any way he wanted. Power reassembled itself into new narratives. For them, the choice was clear and quiet: either run forever or stand and fight together. The latter required a different kind of courage, the kind that admitted reliance. There was a near-death moment when the air in the safe room went thin and someone pounded on the door. They had to make a decision that would cost them both. The path forward would require sacrifice. They had one choice left, and both knew it meant putting flesh where ideology claimed steel. The tribunal reconvened beneath a sky of screens. The whole station sat like a jury with a hunger for spectacle. The Admiral set the terms. A public contest would determine the daughter's fate. The law allowed for a battle measured by methods both archaic and legal. The Queen's seal hung heavy on the announcement, as though it were a physical weight and not just ink. Cameras circled, the feed amplified, and the crowd pressed in tight, until breath tasted shared. Mira stood on a raised platform with her brace visible under ceremonial cloth, a tiny moving island of vulnerability. Jace stood at the platform's foot, his profile a block of human stubbornness. The politician's smile was thin as wire. He called challengers, men and women whose names meant muscle or coin. The station distributed pamphlets praising tradition and threatening consequences for disorder. The impossible choice unfolded like a map of sharp things. The Admiral watched and waited for the moment to force their hands. He had a contingency built into the ritual. If Jace refused to present the daughter for challenge, he would be prosecuted as an abettor, and the daughter's legal status would be revoked in favor of the Admiral's claim. If Mira refused to fight or to accept the ritual, the Queen would disown her, and the station would retaliate. The handlers who had once used Jace now presented him with a single word that held the power of a weapon: comply. The station had gathered a chorus of voices to insist he do so. He could watch a dozen people die to protect their defiance, or he could surrender the daughter to a carefully scripted fate. The crowd's mood sharpened. A vendor shouted that tradition kept order. Someone else hissed that laws were cages for the poor. The legal mediator announced the options in a voice trained for tribunals: duel, arbitration, or exile. The choice felt like picking which limb to lose. In the wings, the Admiral's men flexed and photographed the crowd. The confession that would alter everything arrived in the open like a grenade. Jace climbed the platform because being at the foot felt like cowardice to him. He reached Mira and took her hand with a grip that was both request and decree. Cameras zeroed on the two of them. Their image traveled outward to docks and dens. He looked at the Admiral and did an act no one expected. He disarmed his obligation to his handlers with a single sentence into a microphone: "I will not hand you a woman who has not chosen me." The statement had the force of a plebiscite. It was personal and thus dangerous. The Admiral's smile thinned and his jaw tightened. Public opinion jittered. Mira felt something break inside her. Not a bone this time, but an old doctrine about duty. She could have used the statement to reclaim her agency. Instead, she used it to expose a truth. She stepped forward, removed the ceremonial cloth that hid her brace, and spoke with an unglamorous clarity. "My life is not a ledger item. If anyone would take me, let them win me by choosing me. I will not be a prize to settle debts." The court gasped in a noise like wind. Cameras clicked and network feeds exploded. An advocate for the Admiral cried foul. He demanded the law be enforced. The public response fractured into factions, those who praised them for defying a rigid ritual and those who saw this as lawless spectacle. The Admiral called for an immediate contest under the ancient rules, combatants bound by honor. The problem was not the rules, but the choice before Jace and Mira: save themselves or save others. The Admiral produced a list of demands that threatened the station's fragile supply lines. To defy him would mean risking famine for districts that had no voice. It was an impossible ledger: their love, their survival, versus the needs of many. Jace looked at the faces in the crowd, and his training made him calculate casualty counts and probable outcomes. For a long breath, he considered allowing the ritual to proceed because he believed, in the cold logic of his past, that he could manipulate outcomes. Then he saw Mira's scarred silhouette, and he chose a different calculus. In a gesture that stunned the tribunal, he did not fight to keep the daughter safe at political cost to the many. Instead, he opened his hands and offered himself in place. He walked down into the ring, put his back to the platform, and told the adjudicators with a cadence like a rifle, "If you take me and my life can buy the station one more dawn, then take me. I will not let you gamble on the backs of the vulnerable." The gasp from the audience was raw. Mira screamed, not in pain, but in the grief of someone who would rather die than watch another die for a bargain. She moved forward to stop him, and then stopped, hands trembling, because the weight of his choice made her small. The Admiral smiled then, like a man who thought he had won. He announced a final contest, not for blood, but a test of witness and willingness. The cameras trained like a jury. Public opinion tilted, then turned on the Admiral for his cruelty, then halved again. In a last act of faith, Jace said to Mira, low and iron-soft, "I might be heavy, but you shatter if you bump a table." She laughed, despite herself, bitter and full of recognition. They had publicly traded station safety for personal sacrifice, and the court would decide whether that currency was acceptable. The tribunal's final verdict had not yet been spoken, and the Admiral's men moved like shadows preparing to close ranks. The act of faith had been made. Now consequences would fall like meteors. When the dust settled, there were no clean winners. The tribunal reached a compromise shaped by pressure and panic. Jace would take a public pledge to stand as protector, legally bound, and the Queen would transfer limited lands as restitution. The Admiral gained influence but not absolute control. The station had been braided into a new, uneasy governance. Weeks passed, and the station changed cadence under the strain. Repairs were made to broken windows. The vendor who had been injured returned to his stall with a limp and wore a bandage like a medal. The brace around Mira's sacrum was refined by a machinist who traded favors and scorn. It became an object less of pity and more of adaptation. Her tail never recovered its original arc. The broken segment left an uneven ridge beneath the weave of cloth and metal. That ridge caught light like scar tissue. Jace's side healed in a crooked seam that ran under his ribs, a permanent map of the day he chose. They became public in a way neither desired, ambassadors of a story that newspapers folded into glossy covers. Their partnership was formalized with signatures that smelled faintly of ink and coercion. Neither had turned into the other's savior. They had become the other's necessary ballast. The Queen, who had begun the whole chain with an old law and a colder calculation, watched the outcome and counted victory as a ledger item. Her daughter, once a thing to be moved by decree, now ate at a small table with a human who kept a battered spoon. They found new equilibrium in small gestures. Mira taught Jace to see the slow curves of a permitted pause. He taught her the art of doing nothing for a minute when the world demanded noise. She liked to test his patience by wrapping her tail, reduced, odd but alive, around his wrist like a bracelet. He learned to read the pressure she used for comfort versus command. One night, months later, they returned to the cabin where the defining fracture had occurred. The dent in the doorframe had been patched, but still showed a faint bruise of old weather. They stood in the lamplight where the threadbare quilt smelled faintly of coffee and salt. Mira undid the brace and let her damaged limb rest across his knees. He traced the ridge of the scar beneath the worn cloth and found the smallness of it precious. He whispered, "Not a line of policy now, but of hard-earned softness. Next time, let's start with a handshake." She replied in a voice that had shed ceremony for honesty, "I would like that. Fewer bones, more manners." They did not promise forever. They promised presence. The station's politics moved on. Other disputes flared, other marriages were arranged with less drama, but the memory of their contest hummed in the arteries of civic life. At times, they were called traitors by those who wanted a clearer enemy, and at other times, they were hailed as a model of cross-cultural resilience. Neither label fit easily, and both stuck. In private, they sat on the cabin floor and listened to the fans hum, the same low sound that had kept them awake when they first met. The final image was simple and sharp. Mira's shortened tail coiled around Jace's wrist. His fingers, calloused and honest, brushed the skin where the ridge met flesh. Above them, the station's sky screen showed a nebula's slow drift, colors pooling like ink in water. The world outside remained heavy with history, fleets looming as rumor and old debts humming like moth wings. But here, In that small room, two people bore the evidence of their choices. A scar is a ledger written on skin, and theirs recorded more than pain. They had traded armor for trust. The heavy soldier and the glass princess, bound by broken bone and a healed world, kept their imperfect watch. The future would come with new dangers and new demands. They had learned how to hold one another when the pieces fell. Tradition had been challenged and remade, and the public would talk about it in taverns and forums. But the last line belonged only to them, a private promise against a public wound. They had chosen each other again and again, and that resettled the scale, if only slightly.